happiest days of my life, or some of the happiest days of my life, were spent in the arms of another man's wife. My mother. Happy Mother's Day. Yeah. Gosh, I think I heard someone complaining about being too long on the telephone with their mother recently. And I thought, I would just love one more time to be on the telephone with my mother. I'm going to tell you, I had 4 mothers. Not exactly, but really in essence, in the truth. And it was, I think, all a spiritual plan. But my mother worked a lot during I couldn't remember when she didn't. And she was a very strong physical person. I remember she's part of a family, 13 children and 4 stepchildren, which I guess that's 17. But quite a group. They had their own group, church, and they would meet in on some river someplace for 3 days. It would be like 3 days meeting time. And when all the group got together and brought all their children, it was really quite a deal. And one of the things I remember is that I was probably 4 years old, but I remember my mother being on the other side of a river and coming back and swimming the river and carrying me. And all I had, we didn't have life jackets back then, I had an empty syrup bucket, and she hooked my arm through the thing and took off swimming, and she was just that strong. I mean, it was like I never thought of a moment of fear because I had such confidence in her strength. But then I had a grandmother. It seems as though during the Depression, we moved in with my grandmother. I know that my dad, in sort of paying for it, he poured a concrete top on the what they called a root cellar, where they stored all the things they had canned. And there was something so wonderful about my grandmother. She was a little old lady, but from ages 3 to 6, she pretty well had charge of me. And it was really a wonderful experience. I didn't realize that you don't realize so much when something's going on, but as you look back and sort of learn a little bit about spirituality, it's quite a thing, because she was such a generous person. I could go on a lot, but since a limited amount of time, if there'd just been one, someday I'll tell you a little bit more story about her, because she's worth hearing about. But I know that we had food because she had about 20 acres, and we had a cow. We had lots of chickens, and there was vegetables. The garden was absolutely huge. And there was never a time when there wasn't pinto beans on the table and potatoes. And the potatoes would be stored under the house was sort of on a hill, and the back part had a little gap. And I was the one that I was the right size to go under there and fetch the potatoes. And then there were fruit trees. You think about having a plum tree. I think we had 4 or 5 different types of plum trees. But there were peach trees. There were just a little, even a persimmon tree. I don't know what that was for, but we had it. And she was just the most wonderful person to grow up around because of the way she treated me. We were like best friends. And all my life until she passed away, she felt like my best friend. For some reason or other, one thing, she was non-judgmental. She didn't want anybody picking on me or correcting me, or that type of protection that I had. And then there was my sister. And my sister was, I don't know what she was affected by. She was a very bright person, had a wonderful job with a telephone company, and was promoted. And finally, in the end, when she retired, she was management over quite a number of things, like telephone fraud. She was over the telephone system at UTA. But anyway, the thing she sort of contributed to my life, she made sure she didn't want me listening to country and western or jazz or anything like that. She had a lot of classical record, like Nelson Eddy Alan Jones, Jeanette MacDonald, and all of those people. I listened to those as growing up and thought that was the only music there was. She also influenced what I read, and in summer she would read to me from some of the prose version, the Mary and Charles Lamb prose version of Shakespeare's play. She made sure one summer, she spent the whole summer reading Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. And then there was Cyrano de Bergerac and all of these things she wanted me to know about growing up. And I hated it at the time, but man, but in college that really helped, you know, to know about these things. And then there was the aunt that when my grandmother, when we left at the beginning of World War II, my parents went to a bigger town to get jobs at a sewing uniforms for soldiers and then working on Camp Barclay, which was there in Abilene, about 90 miles from my grandmother. But she then moved in with this aunt that she had actually would be a cousin of mine actually, but since at 2 she moved in with her mother died and she moved in with my grandmother. So it was like just really part of the family. And she was a very unusual person, very close to whatever the rules were, you know, of everything, whether it was grammar or anything. It was very important to her. She wrote poetry. I think that she had a handful published in magazines like Red Book, you know, or I believe that was the name of it. It's been so long I've forgotten. But she wanted to make sure that my grammar was right. And she came to my house to spend her last 3 weeks. She knew she was dying, and she didn't want to stay. Her husband had passed away. Her only son had passed away many years before. And I asked her, I said, what do you think about just coming to my house? She said, well, what if I live for 6 more months? And I said, well, we'll just take it a day at a time. But she came. But the thing I wanted to tell you about is in her last 24 hours, well, she, first of all, I woke up. I was dreaming she was calling me. I couldn't tell whether it was a dream or not, so I got up and I went and sat in a chair right beside her. And then she sort of startled awake, and she looked and saw me, and she said, do you know what? She said, I was dreaming that I was calling you. And so anyway, she was apologetic that she had waked me up in the middle of the night. It's like 2 o'clock, you know. And so I said that was no problem. I said, and I don't remember exactly how I said it, but it was incorrect. But I think I said I was just lying there, awake anyway. And she had the covers up just like this. And she said, lie, lie, no, lay, lie. She conjugated the verb for me. Can you imagine someone with their dying breath correcting your grammar? Well, anyway, that was the 4 ladies that I grew up around. And to me, it's a fascination now looking back, whereas at the time, it didn't always. I know I spent the 6th grade. My dad had some health problems, and I spent that with my aunt and grandmother. And there's so much more to the story, and it really affected how I see life. My grandmother, not knowing there was a depression because she had so much around her, I never got the idea about a depression. But my older brother and sister, you know, they really were into how little there was, and it felt to me like there was abundance. And I guess I've always had that feeling within me that there was plenty of everything, and it seems like that if you think that way, it always turns out that way. But the 4 mothers affected me, and what I did, I wrote down some things that I sort of collected, the ideas from them and from my upbringing, and I wanted to share them with you. But first of all, from the prophet Gibran, reminds us, your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life, longing for itself. It's something that really the brilliant mothers figured out. that is the truth, and then they treat their children that way. Another lady, and this is interesting thought, Anne Lamont, the main thing that ever helped mothers was the other people mothering them, or other mothers mothering them, a chain of mothering that keeps the whole shebang afloat. I like that. Keeping the whole shebang afloat. That's one of our ideas. All right. The thing I saw in mothers is that no one sees God's good in everything like a mother. Have you ever thought about that? No one. No one really. And yet that feeling or that knowing is within us all. But it seems like it takes a mother to be able to see God's good in just everything that there is. I saw that in my grandmother more than anybody else. That she just saw that everywhere. Everywhere she looked, she saw God's good. Now then, it is usually the mother that lets you express your true, authentic self. Have you given that any thought? Ever really occurred to you that a mother is so inclined to let you be whatever direction you're going? I can remember that my dad wanted me from the beginning to be a carpenter because that's what he thought was the most important job in the world. But then I sort of veered off and thought, well, I was going to be a Southern Baptist minister. So I went to college not thinking about construction, even though during the summers, that's how I made enough money to pay the next, buy books or whatever I needed to do, pay rent, because I was already married when I started college. But to permit us to be our true, authentic self. And do you realize that that is one of the attributes of God, that God expressing through mothers, letting you be and grow up to be yourself? And I've noticed that there's no confusion like when that is violated and a mother or father or whatever has a plan, another plan of their own, rather than letting the plan just come forth as it will. Now, a mother, and this I think applies to all four of the ones that a mother can see the magnificent person in a child before it emerges. I like the story of Jack Walsh. Does anybody know who that is? He was the CEO of General Electric. He took them at the worst possible time, and this was like 1981, and he was there until 2000. And this is his words, he was being interviewed, and he said, if you invested in 1981 when I came $10,000, when I left, it was $800,000. I thought, do you know, how did I miss that? But that would have. But he's talked about how his mother influenced him while he was growing up. And he said, I was a stutterer. And there were children that would laugh at me. And mother told me, don't pay any attention to any of that. Said, Jack, you are such a genius that your mind is so far in front of your mouth that it can't catch up. He said, I bought the whole story. He said, I believed it, every bit of it. And do you know, I'm thinking, he really became the genius. And what's unusual is that the genius is always there, more than we ever use. Isn't it amazing how we go through, and it's like in that case, the mother saw that genius, like I think he was 5 when this is being, when he was discussing this. I think I remember that number coming up, being 5 years old and stuttering. But the thought being, within every one, there is so much more than what we use. I think the mothers see that and maybe express it and sometimes encourage it, but it's usually, eventually, all up to us is to explore. It's like having lots of available help dwelling within us and then just using little bits of it, because spiritually, God doesn't require us to use any of our genius. He likes us just like we are. Now, this brings me to another point. When I'm thinking of mothers influencing something, there was Sarah Roosevelt, who was the mother of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I don't believe there was ever a politician that lived that was influenced so much by his mother. She sort of overdid it in that she picked on his wife and really didn't give her much space. Even the grandchildren grew up really thinking Sarah was mother rather than Eleanor. But his life reflected the ability to overcome so much, and so much of it had to do with the way he had been treated growing up. And that is that capability that is within every mother. All right. No one has the power to nurture like a mother. Think about that one. We may have some of that within us because I think there's some of both genders within everybody. I don't really see this thing. I know that I grew up in a time where, we were supposed to be so macho, especially if you were a carpenter or a construction superintendent. I remember leaving my last church and working for a guy, and his concern was that I wasn't going to be tough enough. Of course, it turned out that it worked out all right, but I didn't use the same kind of language. And one day he told me, he said, Glenn, he said, every once in a while, why don't you just say shit? Pardon me, folks, fundamentalists. The Unity folks will understand that. I never gave him the pleasure of hearing that. I worked for him for quite a number of years, but he was a tough old character. He had, before he decided to be a contractor, he was a drill sergeant in a Marine boot camp, so you can imagine what he was like working for. But we have this nurturing, like I said, this piece of nurturing within us, in that there is that femininity that, like I said, back in that day, to say that, I probably would have gotten booed out of a church back then. But I think now that everyone's discovering it, that there is everything within everybody to a certain extent. And so that would mean that the nurturing that is done, we could actually be a part of that. And I think that we are. I think there are men now that are staying home taking care of children like never before. I don't think it's ever been that way before. So in a sense, Mother's Day must mean something to them too. Now, if there is no motherly image in one's life, do you realize that we can mother ourselves? I don't think I ever knew that until I met Pat. But in growing up, that was sort of what she did, and that she got sort of bounced here and there. And so she took it on herself and knew that that was an important piece of her life, apparently. I mean, something within her knew it. I mean, you don't really know that as 4 or 5 years old. But if there's no one else to do it, we have the capability within it to do it ourselves. Now, there's one thing that I think I see in so many people, looking out at so many people, that this idea of honoring one's mother, honoring, no matter what they have been like, it's really, in a sense, not even about them. I know that it's mentioned as I think it's the 4th or 5th commandment. I should know that exactly. I do, but I just, right this moment, I can't think of which one it is, but it's one of those two. But it has with it like a reward. Now, for some reason, it was real easy for me, and I know for other people, maybe it's very difficult, and a lot depends on how the mother is acting, and we just sort of react. But it is so important to honor no matter what has happened, because it's about what is within us. And the thing I wanted to say, and I don't really know that this is a thing you could say that would be a universal truth, but I'm going to say it anyway, you know, because I like to get out on a limb and saw a little bit. But I'm just wondering if there's a person who has, like, not honored, let's put it that way, parents or mother in particular today we're looking at, who's ever really had a happy life. I think it's essential. I think if there's anyone that has gone through something and not honored a parent, and you have an incredibly joyful, happy life, I'd like to know about it, because I don't believe I have ever run across that case of someone who's really turned out to be a joyful, happy, fulfilled person without honoring their mother. Thank you. Happy Mother's Day.